Good morning, church family. It's good to see everybody. We are in Leviticus chapter 1. Leviticus chapter 1, page 107 in my Bible. So it's good to have everybody with us. And for those who are online with us as well, we miss you and hope one of these days you're able to come back and join us as well too in person. We began this study actually from looking at the festivals and then thought that maybe the basic thing to do for this new quarter would actually be go through the Levitical system and the sacrifices. And so we are in the process of kind of making some explanation of that. I want to read Leviticus chapter 1, and then we'll do a little recap and then go a little bit further regarding that. So follow along as I read Leviticus chapter 1, beginning verse 1. And might make mention that the first word in Leviticus in the Hebrew language is and. So Leviticus is a continuation actually of the book of Exodus. And so God continues to reveal himself. So it says, and then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring in your offering of animals from the herd or the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer it, a male without defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. And he shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. And he shall slay the young bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer up the blood and sprinkle the blood around on the altar, that it is at the doorway of the tent of meeting. He shall then skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces, and the sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the pieces, the head and the suet, which is actually the fatty tissue, over the wood, which is on the fire that is on the altar. Its entrails, however, and its legs he shall wash with water. And the priest shall offer up in smoke all of it on the burnt offering for a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. But if his offering is from the flock of the sheep or of the goats for a burnt offering, he shall offer it to a male without defect, and he shall slay it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord, and Aaron's sons the priests shall sprinkle its blood around on the altar. He shall then cut it into pieces with its head and its soot, and the priest shall arrange them on the wood which is on the fire that is on the altar. The entrails, however, and the legs he shall wash with water, and the priest shall offer it all, and offer it up in smoke on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. But if his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, then he shall bring his offering from the turtle doves or from young pigeons. And the priest shall bring it to the altar and wring off its head and offer it up in smoke on the altar, and its blood to be drained out on the side of the altar. He shall also take away its crop with its feathers and cast it aside to the altar eastward to the place of the ashes. Then he shall tear it by its wings, but shall not sever it. And the priest shall offer it up in smoke on the altar on the wood which is on fire. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire, a soothing aroma to the Lord. So last week we explained the idea that the book of Leviticus starts from the most important sacrifices to the less sacrifices when you get into trespass offerings. And not that any offering is less than any other, because all offerings were acceptable to the Lord and explained by him. But the idea that this one, particularly in regard to the burnt offering, is the concept of everything that I am, I offer to you. The next offering will be the meal offering, which will actually indicate everything that I have is offered up to you. And so this one really is an offering of consecration. Now, last week we kind of went through the stages in regard to the offering, which was the idea of presentation. And so the idea of laying on hands was the idea that this really ought to be me. But God has provided this substitute, this offering, on my behalf. You think back about the sacrifice or the offering of Abraham, of Isaac, is this same concept somewhat with the idea of a substitute. With this animal actually becomes a substitute of the idea of consecration that is given to God. So the first one is the idea of presentation. The second one is the idea of laying on of hands. The third stage is the slaying of the substitute victim by the worshiper. And this is hard for us to understand. I mean, this is completely foreign to us to think about the idea. But we talked about what this played in the psychic of the one who was offering. And it is the idea that this really ought to be me. This ought to be me. I mean, it's significant that it took life, it took blood to actually make this presentation. And so you have the slaying of the victim that's there. You have the sprinkling of blood. And you realize this spoke about the idea of atonement, but atonement really is kind of secondary to this idea of the sacrifice, because this is a sacrifice of consecration. And so you had the sprinkling of blood in regard to the side of the altar as well. So I want to go a little bit further with that. The next stage that you find there in Leviticus 1 is the idea of the skinning or the filleting of the animal, right? In Leviticus chapter 7, verse 8, it reveals that the officiating priest is the one who receives the skin of the animal. The only sacrifice that is given in regard to the law of Moses that is not offered in regard to skin is the sacrifice of the red heifer. And you find that later on in the book of Leviticus. There's a purpose in regard to the red heifer that if we get opportunity to talk about, we'll do. But the significance of the red heifer was the idea of consecration, of the idea of anybody who came in contact with a dead body or with a bone or a carcass, whether it was in battle, whether they were in battle and they came close to a body that had died, or whether they were in a house and there was perhaps the mourners who were around and all those things. There was significance in the ashes of the red heifer for cleansing. And by the way, that was also mixed with water. You'll notice that water has a significant part of sacrifice. I'll be talking about this morning the idea of one baptism. And water has always played a significant part in regard to God, and in regard to purity, and in regard to cleansing. So just that's free, okay, as I give that to you. There is no scriptural explanation given of why, in regard to the skin being offered to the priest. Some suggest that this represents Jesus, who gives himself in the covering of our sin. So you have a covering there. Some also suggest maybe that it goes back even to the idea of Adam and Eve. After their sin, you realize that the first animals that were killed were actually to hide the nakedness and the shame that Adam and Eve experienced. There's nothing really that gives us that explanation, even as we can think about that. But some believe that being a sweet savor or a soothing aroma before God, maybe it was that the hide was given to the priest in order that it might not be burned on the fire. Have you ever smelled burnt hair, right? Burning? Um, that's not a soothing aroma. Okay, so that's a stench. So you have this skinning and the flaying of the animal. Now, I'll remind you once again, um, this is one of those things that the worshiper does himself. Um, it's not a pretty sight, right? But there obviously is an awareness of what has happened regarding sin and what God expects and what he receives. The next stage is the idea of dividing the sacrifice into parts. And it's a biblical foundation, really, that you find this concept of covenant involved within those things. In fact, the Hebrew word for making covenant is karoth berith, which literally means to cut a covenant. Second Chronicles chapter 7, verse 18, Haggai chapter 2, verse 5 will make reference to that. The word covenant is berith. And so in Genesis chapter 15, 9 through 15, maybe is highly suggestive in regard to this process of what you find. And in verses 5, 14, and 15, God promised Abraham that he would bless his seed and it'd be as numerous as the stars of heaven. And as a result of that, you find out that Abraham was asked for confirmation, and God gave him one heifer, one she goat, one male goat, one dove, and one pigeon. Now, it's interesting the correlation that happens between that. And he was instructed to divide them into two parts. And actually, verse 17 and 18, it reveals that God symbolically passed between the parts in a pillar of fire. And so in that day, God made a covenant with Abraham. And so there's significance within this idea of the dividing of the sacrifice into parts. Okay. Now, I'll make a note here. This same idea of renewal of covenant is also carried over into the sacrificial system in other places. It cannot be thought of as the making of a covenant, for the worshiper was already in covenant relationship. But it really signifies the idea for the purpose of commitment in regard to renewal, consecration, and maybe in respect to the idea of covenant. Just a side thought here. What about our respect to our covenant that we have with God? What about our consecration to God? And when do you make that renewal? I mean, when you realize maybe that you slipped away from that some, and you realize perhaps that even as you read the Word of God, you're convicted even more. What about that renewal in regard to our minds? And so, I think there's significance here in regard to the idea that the most holy sacrifice that God receives in regard to the sacrificial system is this burnt offering. It's all that I am, I give to you. So I would say to you, anytime that we come to that awareness or that we're reminded about that, maybe even here, right? That we're reminded about that. God is praised from that. And God's blessings come upon us because of our awareness of that. The next stage is the legs and the entrails, right? To be washed. And this was to remove the excess blood and anything that might have contaminated the body. That was to be given as well. Uh, the last stage is the sacrificial burning on the altar. The Hebrew word is katar, uh, and that's a central stage in regard to the burnt offering. Verse 9 literally says in Hebrew, the priest shall burn as incense the whole on the altar of burnt offering, a fire offering a fragrance soothing to Jehovah. So it's a little interesting the Hebrew would give this directive. I mean, it's pretty direct in regard to the idea of this incense being offered. Now, just a side note, I don't know whether we'll make reference to this a little bit early, a little bit later, but there was what was called a continual burnt offering as well. When you get into Leviticus chapter 6 and verse 8 through 13, it speaks about the continual burnt offering that was offered in regard to the nation, not individual, but it was a continued burnt offering in regard to the nation. And it would become a daily burnt offering. In fact, it was offered twice daily. So you get this picture that they're camped around God's place, God's abode. They're camped around it every morning and every evening. Every morning as they rise up, they are reminded of their consecration that they ought to have to God. Every evening before they go to bed, before they go to the tents, or before they lay the heads down, they're reminded of their consecration to God. Last week I spoke about the idea, you ever get around rib crib and the smell? Some people might not say that's a very soothing smell, but it draws you in, right? So Israel was reminded of that. Now, the fact is, they came to the point to where, and the priests are as much at fault of this as anybody. They came to a point as where the daily burnt offerings were not being sacrificed. And in that position, the prophets would make announcements, or the priests would make announcements somehow or another, and they would be reminded that they need to renew their covenant relationship with God. God already made a covenant with them, but their part was being let down in that. So the offering consisted of a lamb with a cereal or a drink offering, Exodus chapter 29, Numbers chapter 28, 5 through 7. God's intended it to be a constant reminder and renewal for Israel's consecration to God as his kingdom, as his people. This seems like an awful question to ask. Should we have the need to be reminded that we're God's people? Or should it come automatically? I mean, should we be reminded? I mean, should we wake up? Should we go to bed being aware of that? Maybe some of this is a reminder to us. I mean, how serious was this to God? It's a continuation of the law that was given, right? This is serious business. This is Jehovah God that we're talking about here. So this continual burnt offering was a constant expression of worship to God and the privilege of their fellowship with him. Is there a privilege in fellowship with God? If we really understood that, maybe it wouldn't be a difficult thing every day to be reminded of that. The fires of the continual offering were never allowed to go out. That instruction was given. Worship is not an occasional exercise. Uh, Now you're going to expect the preacher to say this, okay? Um, but it ought to be understood out of God's word. God expects us to show up at His table. You know, as as a young boy, uh, I was expected to be at the dinner table. There were a few exceptions with that. One was unless I didn't have my chores done, right? Uh, but there are a few exceptions in regard to that. And the extinguished fires would indicate that Israel had forgotten God and they'd forgotten their covenant. Um, and the consequences for letting the fire go out can be found in 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and verses 7 through 8. And in that context of Second Chronicles, you have this idea of the blessings that would come from being obedient and the cursings that would come from being disobedient. And so you have this reminder throughout Old Testament history that their consecration was to be to God. The ritual of the continual burnt offering was basically the same as the individual burnt offering. The purpose, again, is consecration. The exception is that there's no laying on of hands that is done. And even the marginal concept of atonement is absent. And so you have this recognition. And isn't it interesting that God provides that? That He provides this remembrance, okay, of this sacrifice that is being given. God later condemned the sacrifices of Israel. I have enjoyed my study of Isaiah and Isaiah chapter 1 and going into chapter 2. It's hard to read what God says there. He makes reference to the idea of a donkey doesn't know his master, which is a reference to the idea that they had come to the point to where they didn't even recognize who God was. The interesting part about that was the fact that they were still offering sacrifice. I mean, they were still being obedient to offering sacrifice. But in Isaiah, their heart wasn't in it. Can we ever be obedient to the ritual of worship, but our heart not be in it? Does God accept that? You know, I have to be honest with you. I mean, there were times before I really understood everything. I built homes for 12 years, and sometimes during worship, I would think to myself, you know, this has to be done. And I'd make out the order list in regard to what I need to order from the lumberyard or concrete or rebar type thing. And I'd think through that process, and my mind was just tied up with that during worship. And it shouldn't have been. Our time of worship really is that time of worship of remembering God and who God is. Okay. So that's just a confession of mine, I guess. To keep the external rituals without inward consecration is detestable to God. Matthew chapter 15, verse 9, God hates vain rituals. He hates vain rituals. He hates empty rituals. I've also learned. Have you ever have you ever been distracted driving and you know that you started out this place, and then all of a sudden you recognize you're at this place and you don't even remember what happened in between times? Same thing can happen regarding worship, right? Um, Outward acts must reflect inward devotion of the heart. And that is very basic in regard to this sacrifice. Talk about the fulfillment of the burnt offering with Jesus Christ. Okay. Um, One place that you find that is at the baptism of Christ, right? Matthew chapter 3:13 and following. You have this idea that Christ actually comes and makes his presentation of himself for baptism. Remember what John says? I have need of you, right? Why do you come to me? I have need of you. This is a presentation that God is making of himself to God's will. Another one is at the transfiguration of Christ. Uh, Matthew chapter 17, verse 5. You also have this recognition of what's there. Um, John chapter 17. Look with me to John chapter 17. Some of you, what does John chapter 17 remind you of? Yeah. So you have Jesus who has come to the garden. Three disciples. What are they doing? They're sleeping. All right. Um, Jesus is fully aware of what's going to happen, and yet at the same time, he makes his presentation. It makes his presentation in the garden. Um, John chapter 17, begin in verse 13, and we're going to go down here just for a little bit here. Um, but now I come to thee, and these things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy made full in themselves. I have given them thy word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. I do not ask thee to take them out of the world, but to keep them from the evil one. That those Greek combination words there, preserve them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Thy word is truth. As thou hast sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world. This idea of as thou hast sent me into the world, what was the purpose? What was the purpose of God sending him into the world? To save the world from sin, right? So this understanding of the idea that Christ has already, he's already accepted the fact of what he is in the world for. And so the recognition of the idea of presentation is there. Look at Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you. And listen to these words. And he gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. Everything that Jesus was, he gave up for us. What dedication? What single-minded purpose he had. And in all in consecration for God's will and God's purpose, right, in life. Look at Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. Probably have to begin in verse 1. Okay, we're going to end up in verse 7 here. It says, for the law, since it was only the shadow of the good things to come and not the very form of things, can never be by the same sacrifices year by year, which they offer continually, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, because the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins year by year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when he, Jesus, comes into the world, Jesus says, sacrifice and offerings thou hast not desired, but a body thou hast prepared for me. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come. So Jesus has come. Does that speak anything about presentation? Him presenting himself? In the roll of the book of life it is written to me to do thy will, O God. After saying above, sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings, thou hast offerings and sacrifices for sin, thou hast not desired, nor hast thou taken pleasure in them, which according to the law. Then he says, behold, I have come to do thy will. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. Now, there is an interesting play here. When you look back at David's concept in Psalms chapter 40 and verse 6 and 7, which is where this quotation comes from. My translation in regard to that, in verse 5, it says, but a body thou hast prepared for me. The Hebrew will actually say, and some of the translations that you have will actually say, will actually use, instead of body, he uses ears. What does the presentation of a body and ears have in common with each other? It's an interesting question, huh? If God does not have your ears, he will not have your heart. If God doesn't have your ears, he won't have your body. So are we listening? Are we listening to God? And so there's an interesting correlation, I think, that happens with that. In John chapter 2 and verse 17, which is actually a quote out of Psalm 69 and verse 8, it says that his disciples remembered that it is written of him, zeal for your house will consume me. And that's exactly what happened. Jesus' zeal for his Father's house, and not just, we're not talking about this building. We're talking about you. We're talking about me. Zeal for us consumed Jesus. Now, you can say that in a literal sense as well, right? God, or Jesus, offered himself as that sacrifice that was pleasing to God, that took away our sins once for all, the Hebrew writer will say. Once for all. But what did it take? It took Jesus presenting all that he was, all that I am, I consecrate to God. Christ's entire life is a fulfillment of this continual burnt offering. The Hebrew or the Romans writer, Romans chapter 12, will actually speak of us too. Look with me to Romans chapter 12. We got just a minute or two. Romans chapter 12. And what is it that after Paul had preached regarding Jews and Gentiles, after the life of Christ, he comes to Romans 12, verse 1, and he says, I urge you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Some translations will use the word reasonable. Any Old Testament sacrificial language there? You present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice to God. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is an acceptable or well-pleasing and perfect. Okay? So this continual burnt offering in regard to the New Testament with Christ, but it also finds itself with us. You make a presentation, right? Rich, right? And maybe some of the richness we would not know unless we actually go back to Leviticus chapter 1 and understand what happened. And so, we are to imitate Christ as well, right? Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1 and 2 that we read just a little bit ago. Okay. Any comments or thoughts? Brothers and sisters, our lives before God, it's a serious matter. It's a serious matter. There's so many things that can get in the way. Our jobs are a serious matter. Our children, our families are a serious matter. And even in the days of Israel, or in the first century days of the church, all those things were still a serious matter. But there's still something more serious than that. And that's our relationship to God. Can I suggest something else? Specifically regarding this context. Our consecration to God. Our commitment, our devotion, our determination to live for Him is what is really pleasing and soothing to God. So if you want to be right with God, continue to consecrate yourself to who He is and to who we are. Okay. All right. We're going to break for worship. Prepare for worship here in a little bit. I hope that you understand that even as we go through this, worship becomes even more precious to us, for we have the opportunity to give the proper devotion to God who saved us through Jesus Christ. Our expression of worship ought to come from the heart, even as we sing songs of praise or we open up God's word together. Okay? All right. Thank you. We'll break here for worship in just a few minutes.